Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 280, AVS senior writer Mark Henninger and I answer questions from the chat room. And Mark talks about the TAVES show in Toronto that he just attended last weekend. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded November 5th, 2015. Episode 280, Chat Room Q&A. This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by Corning Optical Cables. Corning's incredibly durable Thunderbolt and USB 3-point optical cables are longer, thinner, lighter, and stronger. Go to opticalcablesbycorning.com to learn more. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of AVSForum.com. This week's guest geek is my colleague at AVSForum, Mark Henninger, senior writer there, and we're going to be talking about answering questions in the chat room. Hey, Mark, welcome back.
Hello, Scott. So glad to be here.
Always glad to have you here. Those who are tuned into the live stream at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room there or at irc.twit.tv can post questions for us. In fact, I demand that you post questions for us. I certainly hope that a lot of you will post questions for us because that's what this show is all about today. It's about answering your questions. But while the chat room is queuing up some questions, and there really already are some, I did want to take a few minutes here at the top of the show to for Mark, for you to tell us about the TAVES show that you just went to. It's the Toronto, it's TAVES, is that Toronto Audio Video Entertainment Show? Is that what that means?
Well, according to Suave, who's the gentleman who started it, it was, they used that acronym in the past, but now they're going with the TAVES Consumer Electronics Show because there's a new focus that's going away from strict AV, and there was a lot of 3D printing, drones, personal mobility. In other words, there was other technology present. So they're using the pure acronym and then calling it a consumer electronics show.
Wow! So they kind of went away from what it used to mean. And now they're just calling it TAVES.
Yes. I mean, it still means that, but there's more than audio-visual to it.
Got it. Okay, well, that was in Toronto. It was a pretty big show, as I hear, and you found a lot of interesting stuff. Why don't you tell us about some of the really cool things you found?
Well, the foundation of the show was high-end audio, and there is still quite a bit of that. So, that being my interest, I concentrated on taking demos of some really cool systems. But certainly, I also found it very interesting to walk through and see 3D printers at work, and it really amazes me on an annual basis how much progress is being made in that field. So, at some point, I'm hoping that maybe I can get a 3D printer that can build speaker boxes for me, or maybe even whole speakers. Who knows where that technology will go? But it's worth looking.
Wouldn't that be something?
Sure.
Just build your speaker. Just design a speaker and have the printer print it out. And I can't imagine it would print it out complete. You'd have to do the cabinet and then maybe the drivers. And the drivers, the material of the drivers would be very crucial.
I think you'd be able to certainly make cabinets, but yeah, you're right. Moving parts with wound coils and stuff. That's probably not,
not practical.
Not practical. But what did I see in the show that amazed me? Well, just some really well put together systems that provided that that experience. Whether it was surround sound or two-channel, where you just felt like you're falling into the music. I was getting goosebumps, maybe even a little emotional. I mean, that's what I really look for when I go to a show. I'm looking for those to actually connect with the gear, maybe connect with the music that that's being played in the demo. One of the things I saw that was really cool was the Martin Logan Neolith speakers, which a year ago almost to the day. I mean, it was November 10th of last year. I demoed them at a retail location in Delaware, and I didn't have the perfectionist experience that I expected to have, for a six-figure system during that demo, and they had just come out. Now it's a year later, and I took a second demo of it with. And one of the differences was that an AVS member, David Susilo, was the official calibrator for it. And, he is into using room correction and parametric EQ to deal with room-related issues. Whereas I was thinking about the demo I took a year ago and how that room used passive absorption, bass traps and such to deal with the same issues. And I really thought that the modern EQ-based approach really let those speakers shine, and maybe these guys should let some AVS members get their hands on this audiophile gear and see what we can do with it.
How interesting! We have a picture of you and David actually with the Martin Logan Neolith. I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, it happened to be
now,
Halloween.
you were actually up there on Halloween, right?
Yes, that was Halloween evening right there, which was great because the show was closing and I think everybody was going home to take their kids trick or treating. So right there at that in those last few minutes, we had the room to ourselves and got to turn up the volume, play what we want, and that was actually a really good time.
Yeah, that's hilarious. And looking, I love the fact that you took that picture next to the speaker to show how big that speaker is. It's huge.
It's a monstrosity, and it's even crazier when you think, all these electrostat speakers, they actually have a fairly narrow dispersion pattern, and it's really a single person experience, or maybe two people if they're sitting, one sitting behind the other. But you get the most out of it if you sit precisely centered, sweet spot, everything audiophile correct. A number of other speakers that I heard at the show were much friendlier for larger audiences. But these are just, if you've got the money and you've got the room and you're interested in being completely absorbed and maybe like blown away by your music, they could do it. And it was really nice to hear them fulfilling their potential at this show.
What else did you see there? Just for another couple examples before we get to the chat room, because I do see a bunch of questions.
Let's get way expensive and look at the system that is Nordost Cable, Dan D'Agostino Electronics, and Wilson speakers, because that was interesting.
Oh, man.
See, people know me as a cable skeptic. So for me to walk into this room, we're looking at $150,000 worth of cable here. And
wow.
I actually had a conversation with the rep about it. What's the deal? What's going on here? And I don't know. I don't want to mince words here, but I think that they kind of got away from making extraordinary claims and stuck with something much more basic, or maybe he knew to say this because he knew where I was coming from. But anyway, the explanation for these cables is that the founders of Nordost came from the data, from Silicon Valley, and they were, data centers and cable bandwidth was something that they were fascinated by. So they were talking about how they were working towards cable designs that can carry gigabits of data, without reliably. And then they were like, well, so if you want to buy cables that basically can pass 800 gigabits or who knows what, I forgot, I think that's what they said, 800 gigabits. If you want to buy cables that can do that, it's going to just cost you this small fortune, but and we don't really care if you hear a difference. I mean, I'm really paraphrasing, but he didn't try to make an extraordinary claim. It was just like, here are these cables, they're based on that technology, they'll cost you a fortune, and maybe you'll hear something, maybe you won't. Frankly, I didn't hear the difference. He swapped out a power cable that apparently is $17,000 or something.
Holy smokes.
I catch a lot of flack for not hearing these differences, but hey, to me, that's audio jewelry, Maximus, and that D'Agostino gear that it's connected to, that's also audio jewelry. I mean, it really reminds me of Rolex or something, the way it's machined and the aesthetics.
I'm sure it performs very well.
It performs very well, but like many of these systems, if I think of another system that I heard, which was a Yamaha Bowers and Wilkins system, that one came in around $35,000. So roughly the sales tax on this, and I like that system better. And that's still very expensive. I mean, 35 grand for a stereo is very expensive, but it's just worth noting that price and performance aren't absolutely and directly correlated in the world of audio and video.
Right. We have a picture of that Yamaha B&W system, I think, as well. If we can take a look at that. There it is.
Yeah, and these are relatively new speakers. They were announced or unveiled in New York just a couple months ago, and I was present for that. And that was in a mastering studio. I got to hear them in extremely pristine, practically perfect conditions. And then at this show, the conditions are less than perfect, but they really delivered an experience that reminded me of that unveiling and what they sounded like in a perfect room, basically. So that to me speaks a lot for a speaker, because let's again compared to those neoliths, those didn't seem to be nearly as forgiving. These seem like they're excellent speakers that are also quite forgiving.
Speaking of the neoliths, I Am Special in the chat room is asking a question. Let's start taking some questions here. Are electrostatic speakers with a subunit any good? The short answer is, I would say so. And in fact, those neoliths and virtually all, not all, but almost all electrostatic speakers have a subwoofer unit built in, because those big flat planar speakers don't do bass very well.
That's right. And I thought that the bass was very well integrated. I like to joke that some audiophiles appear to be allergic to good bass, and I've heard criticism leveled towards Martin Logan from some folks that they somehow fail to integrate their bass. The bass is too sloppy or floppy to keep up with the panels. That was not my impression. I do think it's necessary. If you want to get that low frequency extension, there's no way to do it with a electrostatic panel. I mean, certainly not down to the 20 hertz range, and big organ notes. So yeah, these speakers could do it. I mean, there's a 12-inch in the front and a 15-inch in the rear, firing to the rear in each of those cabinets that the electrostatic panel is perched above.
I've always thought that it was better to use subwoofers because than have bass drivers integrated into the full range speakers. Audiophiles disagree with this, but I maintain that the best place in a room for low frequencies to come from is often different than the best place for mids and highs to come from physically in the room, acoustically, which is why I tend to want to separate them out. But a lot of audiophiles prefer to have everything coming from the speakers. Have you developed any sense of a preference there?
I do. I prefer subwoofers, but what you need to remember is that audiophiles aren't necessarily going to use a system that has DSP, which will allow you to set delays. So they're very limited in where they can place the subs, because you can't. If you place a subwoofer further away than the speaker is, there's no way to use the phase control on that subwoofer to get the time right. Now, if it's closer than the speakers, you can use the phase control to add delay, directly within the subwoofer. So that's a problem. If you want to put the subwoofer where it's probably going to be optimal, and that's further away than the speakers, and you refuse to use DSP, then it's not going to work for you. And that's probably the case with a lot of audiophiles. When I listen to a subwoofer in a 2-channel system, I actually tend to put the subwoofer directly between the 2 speakers, right in front of me, just right there. Because then they are actually on the exact same plane, so you don't need any delay. The sound is arriving at the same time. And since it's centered, even if there was a tiny bit of localization, it's not going to, and also it's a near field approach. I mean, real audiophile listening amounts to creating an equilateral triangle and having enough distance from the walls that you're really listening to the primary sound, and then you're hearing the reflections discretely, which creates a sense of space and ambience and so on and so forth. But for hardcore audiophile listening, I actually think that the best place for the sub is right between the 2 main speakers, right in front of you, facing you.
And I'll have to think about that, because normally speaking, I mean, the research done by Floyd Toole and Sean Olive at Harman seemed to indicate that the best place for the subwoofer is along the wall, either at the quarter or halfway point along a wall, or in the corners.
Yes, and I go with corners.
You typically go with corners, as I recall.
Absolutely do. And yes, I was thinking about the Cedia demonstration we had with Anthony Gramani, and he was using, I actually have the same subwoofers that he was using there, the JL E112s, and he had them at the midpoint on each of the side walls.
Exactly.
But yeah, but I agree with that, because that eliminates a secondary reflection that become, you basically get that first wave from the sub, and you also get a reinforcement, especially in the corners. You get a horn loading effect, and that's very easy to use EQ to fix. So you're basically taking maximum advantage of the sensitivity of that subwoofer, getting the most output from it. And again, if you have your delays properly set, it's going to be time aligned. And you also get at least for me, if you take that sort of symmetrical approach with corners or sidewalls, there's also no issue with localization, because you're talking about multiple subs. But right. Sort of putting that sub, to the left, right by the left speaker or right by the right speaker and kind of behind it, which I see in so many setups, that's probably not all that optimal. And working with one subwoofer and being it's probably absolutely fine for movies, but if we're talking about audiophiles and somehow using a subwoofer to augment the music listening experience, it does become a little bit complicated. And and unless you're willing to, again, use digital processing, your options are going to be limited by that fact that you can't delay the primary signal going to the main speakers.
Right. Speaking of signal processing, Adam A. in the chat room is asking, do you think Dirac Live is a big improvement over Odyssey, or should I be looking at other room correction software? You have experience with Dirac that I don't. What do you think about this question?
Well, it comes down to the question. The answer to that is whether you like the fact that Odyssey, or I don't say like, but Odyssey doesn't let you determine a cutoff point if you wish to have one where it no longer applies EQ, whereas Dirac does. So what I really like about Dirac is you can decide exactly how much of the frequency range it processes. And in some circumstances, you might really not want to change what the speakers are doing, and you only want to deal with room-related effects, which
are in the low frequencies.
So some kind of a cutoff between 200 and 400 hertz. It's called the Schneider frequency. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
So you can actually go and find a calculators online and figure it out roughly for where it is for your room. And you can also see it if you take measurements. You can see those interactions, because they cause huge dips and peaks. I think it's absolutely necessary to deal with that. Then it becomes a question of, do you want to do that for the rest of the frequency range, all the way up to where you can't hear it anymore? For home theater, the answer is basically yes, because the room itself is going to interact with the individual speakers and affect their tonality a little bit. And if you really want a neutral, like all the speakers to essentially sound the same within a room, that's really what you want out of room correction, then you're probably going to have to process the whole range. So in that sense, Odyssey is absolutely home theater friendly. But for two-channel listening, where I do think that there's also room for DSP and such, there is an advantage basically to using Dirac Live, because you can really tailor how it processes and how much of the signal it processes to your taste. And in reviews, that's basically what I say is I'm processing away the issues with my room, but I'm not trying to change the character of the speakers by like having it do room correction through the whole bandwidth.
Wes B in the chat. Wes B in the chat room is asking, do you think we will ever get true OTA, over-the-air broadcast signals at 1080p or even 4K in the future? 4K or UHD. I think OTA 4K or UHD is a long way off. They're working on it. They're working on it very diligently. It's a standard called ATSC 3.0, which is for UHD. But that means that the television stations and everybody are going to have to switch over to UHD production within the studio and then send it out. And I don't think stations are going to do that very readily. And while we're at it, 1080p, would they broadcast 1080p? I don't think so. What do you think, Mark?
I think that 1080p broadcast will be demanded because upsampling 1080p is sort of the standard, or what it's an interesting question.
They broadcast at 1080i right now, and so what you need at your end is a deinterlacer, an upscaler to that effect, and they're pretty good these days. So why would the studios, want to spend the extra money and occupy the extra bandwidth to send 1080p to begin with? I don't know.
I would think that only for the main usage scenario I can see for that would be sports, that we would actually want to go to 1080 60p and get the clarity and the speed. You don't, that's where I would see it being desirable and maybe something that they could sell as a premium, experience. I wouldn't think that I don't think every channel would adopt it because, as you said, bandwidth, it's expensive. Cable companies probably can't fit that. But, some sort of ESPN premium, that I could see being done as long as it's, within the realm of possibility for current gear. Because, that there's a wide audience that can watch that because there's quite a few 1080p TVs out there that can handle a 60p signal. Mm-hmm. You don't need a 4K TV to appreciate that. Right. And if you did have a 4K TV, you would see the improvement, in motion resolution that 60p would buy you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Oh, okay. Let's go back to the chat room here. Jimbo was responding to a question, which was about wireless speakers. Oh no, it is Jimbo asked the question. Does a wireless speaker system mean you can lose the AV amp and just use a matrix switch? That's kind of interesting because a wireless speaker system, each speaker will be powered by an amplifier within its own cabinet. So you don't need an amp for that, obviously. However, you still need a processor. You need to be able to decode Dolby Digital and Dolby True HD and all the different audio formats before they're sent out to the speakers. So you need a pre-pro. You don't need an amplifier, so you don't need an audio-video receiver. But you still need some sort of decoding device. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, I certainly would like to see more wireless options. And yeah, building amps into AVRs, I kind of hope that we see the end of that.
Yeah,
I do.
Yeah. Pre-pros, with powered speakers, even if they're wired, but wireless as well. WISA is the wireless audio standard that is sort of the Cadillac or the whatever you want to call it, high end of wireless audio. And if a lot of people adopt that technology, we could see that. That's really something.
Just the rate of obsolescence, to me, to be throwing away perfectly good amps just so that you can upgrade to the latest surround sound standard doesn't make sense anymore.
Right, exactly. Let's see. I saw a question here. By the way, if you're posting questions for us, be sure to put my name or Mark's screen name, iMagic_Mark, or my name, Scott Wilkinson, in the message, because then it comes up in a different color on my screen and I can see it easily. Let's see here. I know that there was a question about a TV. Oh, here it was. Alberta Clipper, would you say a plasma TV, the Panasonic TC P55 GT30 is a good buy for $400? GT30 is a couple of years old now. It's like 3 or 4 years old now. And it was, I think, the next to the top of the line. But it's a plasma. And, for $400, if it's new particularly, I mean, plasmas have a pretty long life, on the order of tens of thousands of hours. So, it's probably not a big deal. I would certainly love plasma. I have a Pioneer Kuro, which is a lot older than that even, that I still use as my flat panel reference. Mark, did you ever see the GT30 or anything in that generation? I know you've looked at some TVs since then.
I owned that TV.
Oh, you owned that TV. Well,
yes, that was my first plasma.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. Well, would you say that $400 is a good deal?
Yes. What are we talking about? Yeah, yeah. What are we even talking about? It was glorious. I mean, okay, you give up 4K, but it makes Blu-rays look fantastic. Great TV. I mean,
there you go. Okay, so there you go. Let's see. Undermined asks, have you heard any infinite baffle DIY home theater sub setups? If so, do you like them or not? Same question for Mark. Mark, you've heard some infinite baffle subs in your time, have you not?
Yes, and that is a very great way to make bass. If, of course, you have a house, a room, if you have the ability to do it.
Right. What does it take?
What does it take? Well, it takes having either an attic space or a basement space or an adjacent room that can essentially serve as a monstrous speaker enclosure. So, a lot of people use their basement and they create a port. I forgot exactly what to call it, but essentially, mount their subs in what looks like a cube, that then fires into up through the floor grill, and so it's one of the cool things about it is if you do have a basement, you can get incredible bass response, and it's essentially invisible at the same time. It doesn't take up any room, but you better have your own house. You're not going to do this in an apartment because you're
not going to do it in any rental, really.
Yeah. You really, but you have to cut holes in your wall, and you have to dedicate a room to being a bass chamber. That's what it takes.
Yeah, exactly. Did you ever hear of there's a subwoofer that looks kind of like a fan, like an air fan that rotates and has blades, and it's an infinite baffle. It's designed to be an infinite baffle subwoofer, but it gets down into the single digit hertz. I think it's TRW. Somebody in the chat room might know what it is. So if you can, if anybody in the chat room remembers, I think it's the TRW17. I can't remember exactly, but that's an example of SoCal Ray Jr. just just corrected your Schroeder frequency is what it's called. Not Schneider.
Schroeder. Schroeder, yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you, SoCal Ray Jr. Really appreciate that.
Sir.
Let's see. Micro Center has an RCA UHD 55 TV for $500. What are the likely drawbacks? Lack of high dynamic range, wider color gamut, probably not a great black level, I would say. RCA used to be a good brand long ago. Now they're not as well respected. So Creamy Corncob bought a Yamaha receiver, HTR 524, with no remote, nothing on eBay. I'm SOL. Can't do anything from the front controls, from the front panel. Oh, man. I would guess the only answer there is a universal remote. Like a Harmony, Logitech Harmony, or a URC that has those codes built into it. There is a place where I got a remote or two. Have you ever done that, Mark? Have you ever? There was a website where you could buy remotes for all kinds of old stuff.
Yeah, I call it eBay.
Yeah, but Creamy Corncob couldn't find it on eBay.
What's the matter? Maybe next week.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna look for that. I'm gonna look for that website, because there was a website that specialized in that. Let's see. Oh, audio bill. Sorry, go ahead.
Just on the eBay thing, I would say that just take a look at the completed listings and see if it pops up on occasion, and then you'll know if it's worth checking.
Good point. Good point. Getting back to subwoofers, Audio Bill is asking, what about ELAC's solution to subwoofers, which is they have an app for the iPhone, and I think Android now as well, that basically you use to tune the sub. You put it up right next to the sub, and it plays through a series of test tones that kind of calibrates the microphone in a sense, and it tells the app what the microphone is doing. And then you take the phone back to your listening position, you do it again, and it sets up the sub for the room. I've heard that work pretty well in demos. I haven't tried it in my own house yet, but that's something that I think is really cool.
I was just on Facebook with Andrew Jones saying, hey, where are my review units? Please get them over to me. It's worth noting that Sonos is also using that technique now, because especially with iOS Apple devices, there's the microphone in there is very well understood. With Android, it's a little bit trickier because there are many different phones with many different mics. But if you have an Apple device, and hopefully in the future, certain Android devices, I see a lot of promise in using that sort of technique. The only concern I'd have is at the very low frequencies, how well those microphones actually handle those. I think there's a real lower limit.
That's a good point. I should ask Andrew about that, and Chris Walker, who's the other guy there. How good are these microphones at those really low frequencies? That's actually a very good question.
The other thing I'd say is that a decent microphone only costs a few bucks that you would just plug into the headphone mic jack on a phone. I wouldn't be surprised if in the future you start seeing a little plug-in mic. Instead of the corded microphone that you usually plug into an AVR, that you just see a little mic that you plug into your phone that actually does have that both the known characteristics and the range to handle whatever it's supposed to measure. I would.
T. Nohans in the chat room is asking, did you ever look into those Android or iPhone apps that claim to help calibrate your TV, and do they do any good? Do they work? I've used the THX app. I forget what it's called. THX. It might still be called THX Optimizer. Yeah, that works pretty good. It was limited. I haven't done it in a while. Have you ever tried it, Mark?
I have not.
No, I haven't done it in a while, and I have to say, I remember there might have been one control that it didn't have an app for, or didn't have a thing to adjust. Somebody in the chat room might be able to tell me that. SoCal Ray Jr. or somebody like that. But generally speaking, I think the THX app works pretty good. I've not tried any others. So, well, listen, we got a bunch more questions in the chat room. And before we get to them, though, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this episode, which is Corning Optical Cables. Corning has transformed the traditional USB and Thunderbolt cables from plain old copper into incredibly durable fiber optic speed demons. Whether you're into high-end video, photography, audio production, or computing, you want the best, most reliable cables out there. Now take a look at Corning's Thunderbolt and USB 3-point optical cables. I actually have one here that I have a USB cable that I have connected to my printer, and I have tied it in a knot before I connected it to the printer. Now dig this. I actually was at a SMPTE Tech conference last week, and Corning was there. And I talked to the guy, and I said, "You're kidding me. You can't really tie them in a knot that tight, can you?" And he went, "Oh, yeah?" And he went like this. And it still worked. It still worked beautifully. So, I would never think of doing that to any regular fiber optic cable, but these Corning cables are really, really amazing in that regard. Corning has figured out a way to make their USB and Thunderbolt cables super strong and flexible. So flexible, you can bend them, walk on them, even tie them in a knot, as I just did, and a tight knot at that, and they keep transmitting at top speeds. Now, you'd think that they're glass and glass breaks, right? Well, Corning is known for fiber optics, and they have figured out a way to get past that particular limitation. Now, speaking of speed, Corning fiber optic cables provide incredible data rates of up to 20 gigabits per second for Thunderbolt and 5 gigabits per second for USB 3. No other cable comes close. Another interesting fact is that Corning optical cables are 50% thinner and 80% lighter than traditional copper cables. And Corning optical cables have exceptional cable runs of up to 60 meters, 200 feet, for Thunderbolt, and 50 meters, or 165 feet, for USB 3. Now you can declutter, move peripherals into another room, improve productivity, and increase security by putting all that expensive gear out of the way. Corning optical cables are longer, thinner, lighter, and stronger. Go to opticalcablesbycorning.com to learn more. And we thank Corning very much for their support of Home Theater Geeks. So, tons of more questions in the chat room. We'll get to as many as we can here. Kitty is asking, Atmos upfiring reflectors, upfiring speakers that reflect off the ceiling don't work great, but in-ceiling speakers require holes in the ceiling. Any thoughts about on-ceiling speakers? Just use surround FX speakers bolted to the ceiling? Mark, you've got a lot of experience with Atmos. What's your response to Kitty?
I'd say do it. Absolutely. That works fantastically well.
So just regular old surround FX, surround speakers, just bolt them on the ceiling.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get brackets so you can aim them, I mean, that's kind of important. You don't want them to just, especially the front ones, you don't want them pointing straight down. You do want them pointing towards, you know, the actual seats. But yes, it absolutely works. In fact, I would say one of the problems with in-ceiling speakers is unless they're aimable, then they require a super wide dispersion pattern and they kind of spray sound uselessly. So that ability to aim them and with satellites and a bracket, you should be able to aim it very easily. Most, you know, there are lots of aftermarket brackets that let you do that. That's actually an extremely great way to do it.
Cool. Sandman found the answer to the question that I had. I couldn't remember the model or even the make of that gigantic, or not, it's not even gigantic, but that fan-like subwoofer. It's called the TRW17. I was right about that. From Eminent Technology. It's really interesting. You should check that out. You should definitely check that out. Replacement Remotes website, Magic Jester is telling me. So let me just quickly go there and see if I can find remote replacement. I'll have to look at that while you're talking about something else. Let me go back to the chat room for now. Let's see. UJ, if you would like to see AVRs go away, what would you recommend as a mid-priced pre-pro amp solution?
Well,
that's a good question.
I'd like to see more mid-priced pre-pros, which we're not going to see that many of until AVRs with amps are viewed as kind of obsolete, which would require active speakers to gain some traction in the market. So right now, I can't really recommend one. As a rule, you kind of do usually get at least as much value per dollar out of the AVR as you do out of within any company's given line, their equivalent pre-pro. It's always been sort of a mystery to me. You really don't pay for those amps to be in there. They're just there. And the pre-pro ends up being the same device without the amps. Kind of disappointing.
Yes, exactly. On the other hand, buying an AVR, I talk to a lot of people, and I hear a lot of people talking about buying an AVR and then using it as a pre-pro. And my response to that is, well, why? Now, pre-pros, tend to be more expensive. I think the ones that I normally recommend are in the $1,500, $2,000 range from Integra, Marantz, Onkyo, which is related to Integra.
If you're not looking for surround sound, the Emotiva, once again, that XMC1 is very popular on AVS. It's got the Dirac built into it and some very high-end specs. I think that's $2,000. But yeah, you're looking at the pre-pros.
Is that you said not interested in surround? You mean that's a 2-channel?
Oh no, I'm sorry. No. If you're not interested in Atmos, if you're not interested in
immersive audio, right?
Yeah, if 7-channel processing is what works for you, then that's actually a very popular option on AVS. But yeah, I agree with you. For the most part, you're looking at the major brands, the Onkyo and Denon, Marantz's of the world. And yeah, that's about the price point, right around $1,500 or $2,000. But yeah, you don't get anything more for your money, frustratingly.
Yes.
Okay, but sometimes you get, I guess what you do get on them is balanced outputs. Typically, when you have amps, they don't include balanced outputs, mostly because of space savings. That's where the speaker terminals usually go. So I guess you get something.
Exactly. Let's see. Game Singer's asking, when do you expect the standard for HDR, high dynamic range, and wide color gamut to be finished? Once the standard is finished, how soon would you expect to see a TV that supports the standard? Boy, that's a big question, man. The HDR, there are some standards, and I emphasize that plural, that are being implemented. Vizio has implemented Dolby Vision, while Samsung and LG and Panasonic and Sony have implemented what's generically called HDR10, which is the SMPTE standard, more or less. And so that's what we have. Although, you know what? Well, I mentioned the SMPTE Tech Conference I was at last week, and I saw a new standard being proposed by the BBC and NHK. BBC, of course, is in England. NHK is the Japanese public television station. And they have joined together to make a new HDR standard they call HLG, Hybrid Log Gamma. And the interesting thing about, and this is has to do with what's called the EOTF, the electro-optical transfer function, which is how the signal coming into the TV gets translated into how much light comes out, and the OETF, the optoelectrical transfer function, which is the function in the camera that converts the amount of light coming in to different code values. The interesting thing about HLG is that it does not require metadata. HDR10 and Dolby Vision both use metadata, which is data not about the signal itself, but it tells the display what to do with this extra information in high dynamic range. And in some cases, it tells the display to switch into its high dynamic range mode. So we saw an example of a Samsung TV that was doing it, and Sony was showing an example of how it was doing it as well. And the cool thing was that it was the same signal was being sent to both a high dynamic range set and a standard dynamic range set. And because there's no metadata, the standard dynamic range set was able to deal with it. It couldn't show high dynamic range, but it showed something reasonable. And I thought that was very interesting. I was a little disappointed, though, that yet another thing in the mix. And so your question, Game Singer, about, when are we going to get a final standard is a really good question. And which TVs are going to implement which one is another really big question that I'm still waiting to hear a good answer for. In fact, I'm scheduling a fellow from the CEA, Consumer Electronics Association, to talk about exactly that on this show, which is basically how does it, if a TV implements one or the other of these systems and it gets a signal that's a different of one of the other systems, what's it going to do? Is it going to choke? Is it going to show it somehow? We don't know. So you're exactly right. There's still a ton of stuff waiting to be finalized. The color gamut question is another one. Everyone's talking about BT 2020, which is this very expanded color gamut, but there are no TVs that can do it. There are a few, I guess, that get most of the way there. But again, each TV is going to be slightly different. None of them are going to really reach 2020. There's the digital cinema color gamut is called P3. And I think that is a better goal to shoot for, at least in the shorter term, because it's achievable now. Movies are already mastered in it. So it would be a much simpler thing to take a movie master and bring it into the home without having to worry about regrading the color and stuff like that. So I think P3 is what would be a better short-term solution, but everyone's talking about 2020. So when will all this be finished? That's a very good question. Next year sometime. I'm sure we'll see a bunch of cool stuff at CES in this regard, but when it's going to finally be done. I actually talked to some of the SpectraCal guys. SpectraCal is the company that makes calibration software, and they've been on the show a number of times. And they bemoaned the fact that early adopters of high dynamic range might get left out in the cold a bit. The first generation of TVs are going to have this incompatibility problem, whereas second or third generation TVs will probably have the decoders for both high dynamic range, for different high dynamic range systems built in, so they won't care. Just like AV receivers today have Dolby Digital, Dolby True HD, DTS, and all these different systems built in, and they'll accept whatever they get and decode it properly. I'm waiting for the time when TVs will do that, and at the moment they don't. We expect, hopefully they will. We'll see maybe some TVs at CES this year that do that. Mark, go ahead.
I just want to beg the question of whether the TV has to do that, or if you would be able to build that into, let's say, the Ultra HD Blu-ray player or a Roku 5 or something, and actually just have it be able to, like today, you know, you can take one surround format and have it basically translated into PCM, like maybe whatever the baseline standard is, or maybe just, you know, somehow be able to do that conversion before it goes out to the TV. I mean, hope we see something like that.
That's a good question. Could it be decoded in the player? But then the question is, what are you sending to the TV? That could end up being much more data than HDMI could convey, for example. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to think about that and do some research on it. Let's see. SSB in the chat room saying, when you had Panamorph on, and we did have a couple guys from Panamorph on a while ago, they were showing a system that encoded extra data. Oh, yeah, in the letterbox bars. I have not heard anything more about that technology getting picked up. We will see if we can see that. Oh, Darkroom 08, thank you. Any 21 by 9 TVs at CEDIA? I didn't see any. Did you, Mark?
No, did not see that.
That's a pretty specialized thing. You know,
I've only seen those. I've only seen them in the context of LG and Samsung last year, right? But those weren't real TVs. They weren't. They're like concept cars, essentially.
Exactly. And they're gigantic. They were 105 inches wide, and they cost well into 6 figures. Vizio had shown 21 by 9 TVs a couple of years ago, but we haven't seen anything like that from them lately. So I don't think we're going to see much of that. It's more to do, if you really want to go 21 by 9 or 2.35 to 1, as it's more commonly called, you'll want to go with a projector and a screen of that orientation. Let's see. Yes, Undermined. Super MHL to the rescue. That's a very good point. Going back to the point about decoding high dynamic range in the player and sending that along. Super MHL, of course, has the biggest bandwidth of any of the connections. We heard some talk about that at the SMPTE Tech conference as well. HDMI 2.0 maxes out at 18 gigabits. DisplayPort 1.3, which is not commonly available yet, is I think 21 gigabits. And Super MHL is much higher than that, in the 30s, 40s, 50s gigabits. Somebody in the chat room will know the answer to that. Compter says, oh no, I hope I'm not screwed. I have a 4K TV that supports HDR. Yeah, man, early adopters. It's the curse of the early adopters. You know, it depends on which one you have. You know, if it's HDR10, like the Samsung or LG or Panasonic or Sony at this point, I tend to think that that's what most of the content, of the early content anyway, that's going to come out is going to be in that format. So you're probably okay. But if you have a Vizio reference series, well, nobody does yet, but they will soon. They're going to be selling them soon. That will do Dolby Vision, but it will not do HDR10, at least not the first generation. So it's a mess out there. No question about that. User 0266, did any of the new projectors do true 4096 by 3112 4K? No, it would be 4096 by 2160. And the answer is Sony's been doing that for years. They've been doing that for at least 3 years. And their new projectors do the same thing. They've got true 4K imaging chips in their SXRD, which is their form of LCOS, liquid crystalline silicon. And they do true 4K They're the only company I know that does. They're the only company that has, well, almost the only company that has consumer-grade 4K projectors. Everybody else has 1080p or what we call faux K, F-A-U-X, which is 1080p that's been jiggled up to UHD resolution. But Sony's the only one. You could buy a digital cinema projector from Quantum Media Systems or Barco or Christie, but then you're talking six figures, and you would want a really big room for that. Let's see what we got here. Yes, Control Freak. The ancient engineer said, that's what's so great about standards. There are so many of them. True enough. So let's see, Mark, what do we got here? Oh, here we go. Adam A. With Atmos, do you follow Dolby's speaker layout with ceiling speakers, or do you have your own placement? I see Anthony Grimani has different placement and uses dipoles. Well, his new speakers, which we're going to be talking about this Saturday on the new screensavers, are not dipoles. But that may be an earlier thing. Mark, what's your preferred speaker layout for Atmos?
I do follow Dolby recommendations, but I have also experimented with alternatives. And I think what you're going to see is, as time progresses, what constitutes a Dolby recommendation will expand. But right now, essentially, my elevation channels are placed above the corresponding ear level speaker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I haven't put Atmos in my home yet, partly because my theater's a little oddly shaped, and when I set it up, I had no concept of putting overhead speakers in. But I am going to do it. I'm figuring out a way to do it one way or another. And,
I also don't agree with comments that the reflected sound is simply no good. I mean,
tell us more.
If you do it right, it varies from module to module. Essentially, so that's what I would say. Don't it's like just judging any other speaker. You can't just make a blanket statement. Some of the modules work better than others, and also how high you place them relative to where you're seated makes a difference, because it's a question of how much of that leaked sound is getting to your ear before the reflected sound gets to your ear, and you need the reflected sound to be louder than whatever leakage is occurring. Dolby's recommendations on the modules are that it has to be within 3 feet of the actual speaker. And I have generally interpreted that as, okay, so I can actually raise that module further up than it would simply be placed on top of the speaker. I know it sounds kind of funny, but it's like if you put a short speaker stand on top of your speaker and put the module on top of that, you'll get a better result. Because more of that sound is going to get to the ceiling and then reflect. The sound that does reflect off of the ceiling, if you do a good system, it really does sound like there's an in-ceiling speaker there. The only other minus is output capability. I mean, I've seen some really weak modules that just have a tiny little driver in there. That's not too cool. You really do need that speaker to be kind of powerful. So, to get a good module, it does have to have a lot of output. It does have to have some accommodation. Like usually there's some kind of foam padding and it's recessed. I'm going to think of, I'm drawing a blank here. That's really a shame. What's that company that is home theater specialist that you buy the custom ordered speaker? Triad. Okay, so Triad has nicely designed modules, that actually try to absorb some of that initial leakage, that's caused by dispersion. And so, all I would say is a properly designed module, well placed, actually does work very well. And the Triad demo at CEDIA was proof of that to me.
Somebody here in the chat room, and it kind of bounces around here, so pardon me for, here it is. Eric Duckman pointed out replacementremotes.com, and he found /Yamaha /buy RAV203 and so on and so forth, remote control. So you might be able to get that remote from replacementremotes.com. Barfel loves his Emotiva speakers, and it just jumped out at me, so sorry about that. Let's see. Yeah, user 0266. All that's all silliness. All the different formats for HDR. I agree. We are in the very early days. We are in the infancy of the HDR revolution. But I got to tell you, everything I've seen in HDR, stuff that's been graded in HDR and displayed in HDR, high dynamic range, looks phenomenal. This is not another 3D, oh, it's a gimmick, it's a fad, it's going to go away. This is the real deal. It's something very important. Let's see, Marsworm, what's the use of an HDMI sub port on an AVR? Can the signal be active at the same time, like a 1080p? I'm not quite sure I understand, Marsworm. HDMI sub port, you mean subwoofer? Or do you mean like, I'm not quite sure what you mean. So get me a little more information here and we'll be glad to talk about that. User 0266, did you get a chance to explain ARC, A-R-C? Audio return channel. What I don't get is you have your TV and the HDMI out of the receiver, and I guess you would need an HDMI in for that audio. No, is that right? No, it is not right. The cool thing about audio return channel is that you've got an HDMI cable that's going from an HDMI out on the receiver or the pre-pro to the HDMI in on the TV. But the question is, TVs are smart these days. They have these apps built in for Amazon and Roku and so on. And how does that audio get back to the receiver? It used to be that you had to connect another cable from the TV back to the receiver. But with audio return channel, you don't. The audio from within the TV gets sent back to the receiver on the same HDMI cable that's sending it the video information and audio from external sources. So that's the beauty of it, is that you only need one cable connecting the TV to the AV receiver or pre-pro, and the TV's own internal audio from apps or its over-the-air tuner or whatever can go back to the receiver over that same cable. So I find that to be pretty darn cool. Let's see. Well, yeah, we getting quite a bit of Atmos here. What do you think of the prospect of using height speakers angled down at the main listening position, MLP, versus up-firing Dolby Atmos speaker or up-firing modules? I guess what he's maybe saying there, Mark, is to maybe not put the speakers exactly overhead, but kind of in the corners maybe, or even if they are overhead. You mentioned earlier about how you want to aim them at the main listening position, right?
Well, okay, so I guess maybe there is some question about what is the exact right positioning. I think it's above the actual speakers, the surround speakers in the front, left, right. So that's not really, that is kind of a little bit out to the sides. It's not like, I don't know how to put that. I do think that you don't want it directly over your head, because then that's the speaker that you're going to hear. You kind of want them a little bit to the side and then aimed towards that. And obviously for the front ones, that would be for the rare overheads. For the front ones, you absolutely want to aim them, because like I was saying earlier, otherwise you're basically spraying sound all through the room, and it's going to bounce off of walls and it's going to get diffused, and it might end up sounding, just not as specific. So I do like it when you get what I would describe as overhead imaging, where those sounds that are flying around do sound like discrete objects. And I think the best way to do that is to literally position the Dolby speakers above the front, left, right channels and the side surrounds, or the actual surrounds as opposed to the rare surrounds. Another related
question is, there are many systems that you can buy now that have 2 overhead speakers for Atmos, and there are others where you have 4. And I've always maintained that having 4 is much better. Do you agree?
It's quite a bit better. I've heard a few 0.2, whatever it is, 2-channel overhead systems that actually sounded pretty good. I'm going to say that it depends on how the movie is mixed as well.
Good point.
You're not going to get that overhead tracking like let's put it this way. If the effect that you want to hear is just rain coming from overhead, 2 speakers can do that pretty convincingly. But if you want to hear like an airplane flying over you and have that pan, overhead, then 4 speakers will do that much better because you'll hear it start behind you and then it'll proceed in front of you. But again, if it's just an ambient effect, like you're in a cave and you hear that echo coming off the ceiling or whatever, and it's just an ambient sound, then two will work. In fact, 2 reflective Atmos speakers will work and create that effect pretty convincingly. So again, it just depends on the mix and your intended use and how picky you are about what you're hearing up there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Adam A. is asking what crossover you use for the Atmos overhead speakers.
You don't get to choose. Oh, okay. For the overheads. No, you do get to choose for overheads.
Oh,
You're
you
right.
do get to choose. Okay.
Yeah, I guess it's reflectives that are... Am I thinking straight? No, I'm not thinking straight. Thanks for stumping me.
We stumped Mark. All right. Well, okay. You're going to think about that. But so we'll go on to another question. Shivers asks, what is the rate of new 4K content? Are we at the point where we should get a 4K capable TV soon? And this is the question that I get asked all the time. And it's a tricky question. 4K content is here. It is coming. There will be more and more of it. At CES, we will see, hopefully, Ultra HD Blu-ray, and that'll be plenty of 4K content. But the question of whether you should get one now, 4K TV, is almost moot in my estimation, because virtually all manufacturers, that's almost all they're making. At least from the mid-end to the high-end. You might be able to get a 1080p set at the low end. I think the Vizio E-Series is 1080p, but the M-Series, the midline, is already UHD 4K. And most other manufacturers, the same thing. So unless you're looking for a really super cheap, low-end model, you're going to get 4K, whether you like it or not. So that's why I say the question is kind of moot. But... but it won't necessarily do high dynamic range, and if it does, it'll only do one type, as we were talking about before. It's a tough question. It's a tough question. Mark, do you have anything to say about that?
First of all, I'd like to see HDR make it into every TV that's sold in the future, even if it's only 1080p.
I agree. I totally agree.
But I don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, I think Dolby is a big name, and as I gather it, we're not gonna. Dolby's business plan is not to have this extremely specialized, Vizio luxury TV be the only thing that you can watch HDR on. So
it can watch Dolby Vision on.
Right, that you can watch Dolby Vision on. So, I guess what I want to see is whether Vizio next year would put HDR on all their TVs. Wouldn't that be interesting?
Wouldn't that be interesting? I did get a question from in my mailbag, in my email, that said, will the P series, the Vizio P series, get HDR? And I think the answer is no. Have you heard anything different?
Gosh, I'm guessing yes. I'm guessing we're going to definitely see it. But the question is if or when they're going to update that series,
right.
Which I have harassed them every single time I've spoken to Vizio people, and they are absolutely lips are sealed, no hints. I've got one comment about I'm a pretty perceptive dude or something like that, which made me think, yeah, that's what the P series upgrade or update is going to be about, is adding that HDR capability. Why wouldn't they? I mean, or the alternative is that the M series gets it and the P series doesn't. I mean, that doesn't even.
Yeah, that wouldn't work. No,
that wouldn't work. It's the logical upgrade for the P series is to get
if it has the capability, if it has the physical capability of putting out enough light to have the peak brightness be what it needs to be for high dynamic range.
Yeah, that's the caveat. But I hope.
Yeah. Me too. SoundPro69 is asking, I'm a lover of multi-channel music listening. Mark, I know you are as well as I am. For purely acoustic music, it is my experience that multi-channel brings the hall experience much more vividly, if at the expense of razor-sharp imaging. And that's a good point. What do you think about immersive audio exclusively for acoustic music listening?
Oh,
Mark,
boy,
what do you say?
I think that's it. It's the answer. Ambience extraction is the best way to listen to acoustic music, record in a hall, whatever have you. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that all concert venues depend on their ceiling to create the sense of ambience. I mean, if you go into a warehouse with a low ceiling, you're never going to put a symphony orchestra in there and have it sound right. You really have to have this giant arching ceiling. And in fact, halls are designed with reverbs that suit the particular music type. So you've got a cathedral, and you've got these choirs and this organ, and they take care of the advantage of that extremely long decay. Then you've got opera, which has a shorter reverb time, but still longer than an orchestral concert hall, because that's what suits the music. And orchestral concert halls have a reverb time that's suitable to that, and a jazz club has a reverb time that's suitable to that music type. So in essence, you need, and that reverb is coming from the ceiling, and the only way to replicate that at home is to have ceilings speakers or speakers pointed at your ceiling. If you're just bouncing sounds off of your walls, by spraying it and essentially lighting up the walls with your 2-channel rig, or you have a 5-channel rig, you're basically listening to you're listening to 2-dimensional music. I mean, you're listening to a flat circle, but but any concert venue you go to, what you're really hearing is a huge part of that sound is the ceiling. So yes, ambience extraction that involves ceiling speakers is the right way to listen to acoustically recorded music. In my view,
agree.
period.
Yeah, no, I agree. Undermined is asking, have you heard any more info about DTS Headphone X coming to AVRs? I want it on my next AVR upgrade, but haven't really heard much about it lately. I haven't either, to tell you the truth. I've heard it, and it's very impressive. Speaking of immersive audio, it does have this immersive audio aspect to it, simulated through headphones. But I haven't heard much about it lately either. Have you, Mark?
DTSX, I guess they're thinking
DTS
January.
Headphone X.
Oh,
Headphone
no,
X.
that's been sort of pushed aside. You're right.
Seems to me to be in favor of DTS-X, which is their answer to Atmos and Oro, which is actually putting speakers all around you. So we haven't heard much about it. Compter asks, will we see the Samsung UHD Blu-ray player by Christmas? I would say no. Mark?
I'm also saying no. I think that their CES is going to be all about these players.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. So we've got a bunch more questions. I'm kind of down at the bottom of the page. We still have some good questions, but we're out of time. So I want to thank everybody for their great questions today. It's been wonderful fun to talk about all this stuff, as it always is. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. I tried to get to as many as I could, but I believe that we must now say goodbye. So I want to thank Mark Henninger very much for being here. Mark, thanks as always.
Oh, thank you. And I'm so sad I have to go already.
I know. This hour just zips right by, doesn't it?
It's gone.
It's gone. You can get much more information about all this stuff and much more at avsforum.com, which is where Mark and I both live online. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott, also at AVSForum, which is really following Mark on at AVSForum. You can always find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here at twit.tv/HTG and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twithometheatergeeks. Next week, my scheduled guest geek just informed me before we went on the air here that he has to bail. So I am going to be looking for another one. And I'm sure I will find one. And there are, in fact, a couple that are on the line almost as we speak. So it'll sure be somebody who is very interesting and has lots of cool stuff to talk about in this realm of audio-video geekery. I also want to make sure that you know that this coming Saturday, November 7th, I will be filling in for Leo Laporte on the Tech Guy radio show for all 3 hours from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Pacific time. So if you can find a radio station in your area that carries the show, I encourage you to tune in and listen. If not, sign on to live.twit.tv during that time, and you'll get to see all the happenings in the studio as I take the helm for 3 hours. Should be loads of fun. Oh, and there's a special guest coming on the show at 11:30, my normal time, Douglas Trumbull, special effects legend, is going to be on, and I'm going to be talking with him for a few minutes about his latest work. So I do hope you will join me for that and for Home Theater Geeks next week. Until then, geek out.